Thanks. 1 second. I'll put mine back up again. All right. Well, thanks so much for all being here. Thank you to the students to organize this. Thank you to the IT team, the caterers, everybody else. It's an absolute pleasure to be on a panel with such great people. I'll try and keep my remarks brief, which is, never a guarantee. It's not a trillion minutes in the day. But my goal, I think, with this is to try and convince you all, now that we've got you here with the big splashy headline, now that we've managed to break through in the popular media discourse with a number so big that it breaks people's sense of norms, to try and make a reasonable case, not the crazy person case that I get associated with, but the other one. And the case that I want to make today, and hopefully we can kind of tease it out with everybody else with their respective expertise, is that default is the worst possible case scenario. Default is the actual extreme thing that we're talking about here. Of all the ways that this could end, anybody being responsible for allowing the United States to default, not just on its existing treasury debt, but on the obligations to pensioners, to employees, to people who've got contracts with the US government, that would hurt real people, cause pain, cause suffering, cause economic devastation. We can joke about accounting gimmicks, we can joke about political hardball, but there are real people that are going to suffer if we don't actually resolve this problem. That's the first point that I want to make. As a lawyer, as a law professor, I want to make the point also that there is no actual constitutional basis for defaulting. Not the Treasury, not the President, not the Supreme Court, and not the Federal Reserve. The 14th Amendment that says the debt shall not be questioned. Article 2 that says the President shall take care to honor laws passed by Congress. We are talking about bills that have already been sent out, as Stephanie said. And the question is, does anybody have the right to second guess those bills and put people in economic pain as a result? And I'm very, very grateful that Eric Foner, the historian of the Civil War, had an article in the New York Times today talking about the 14th Amendment, where the point that he makes is the 14th Amendment was instigated to ensure not only that individuals would somehow try to prevent Civil War debts from being paid, but actually that Congress itself couldn't retroactively undermine the debts that were already incurred. A future white supremacist Congress that managed to take back over the United States could not retroactively declare the debts incurred during the Civil War invalid. This was a constitutional provision higher than any individual branch of government. To the extent that we believe in constitutional governance at all, the Constitution said neither the president, nor the judiciary, nor the legislature itself can undermine the debts that have already been incurred. So when we are talking about extreme catastrophic scenarios, when we are talking about who is exercising an extreme acquisition of power that they do not have, anybody that tells you that they can cause default, that it's their right to say options to avoid default are being taken off the table, are being the constitutional extremists in this conversation. And I hope that we can get to the point where people feel convinced by that by the end of this conversation. So I think this is a stupid made-up rule. I've gone into a lot of legislative history about what its actual purpose was. The debt ceiling's job was to make it easier for the executive branch to spend what Congress had told them to spend, not harder, to take 100 different individual spending authorities and combine them together. And ultimately, that happened at the same time as Congress tightened the screws on how much to spend. They said, you can't spend more than we tell you, you can't spend less than we tell you. Like Goldilocks, you have to spend just right. But when we tell you how much to spend, you don't have a reason not to do it. You have the discretion to use whatever tools at your availability, but you cannot say no. And that is not only in the Constitution, that is not only in the basic sort of 6th grade social studies separation of powers, it's also 180 years of Supreme Court precedent going back to 1838 with Kendall v. Stokes, where the court said that once Congress has determined that certain spending be made, the executive branch has no constitutional power not to spend. Note there, the executive branch, not the president and the treasury, but the Fed gets to do what they want. But the entire executive branch, every single entity that stands between the coin being minted and default, who obstructs the coin being minted, in the way for default, is violating Supreme Court precedent. And that includes the contemporary Supreme Court if they were to go that far. The good news is, I don't think the Federal Reserve or the Supreme Court is politically suicidal. I disagree with a lot of what they both do, but I don't think they are that suicidal that they would want to be responsible to put their hand up to cause a default. So the question I think to ask ourselves is there a world in which every other possible outcome gets exhausted and that the choice is really default or minting the coin? I am not here to tell you that it has to be your favorite option or that it even should be the option that you think is the most sensible. I have reasons pedagogically why I like it, but you don't have to share them in the slightest. But what I do want to try to make the case is that when you're faced between a cliff and pressing a button that sounds a bit unusual, it's the button that we should be talking about, not the cliff. And when we are looking at this moment, what we are hearing from the Democratic White House and the Treasury Secretary, not the Republicans who are so nihilistic that I don't think they even deserve to be taken seriously in this conversation, but the people that are claiming to be adults in the room. What they are saying is that if we don't resolve this through the political process in Congress, we will barrel off a cliff and hit default once we exhaust every other extraordinary measure. And the answer, the question I think that has to be posed to them is, the coin has to be the alternative. Why are you not willing to consider the coin when the alternative is so catastrophic, is such a constitutional crisis? The Federal Reserve might not accept it, is what Treasury Secretary Yellen said over the weekend. Well, last I checked, the Federal Reserve is not a constitutional law scholar, and it's certainly not a higher power than the Constitution itself. So where is the Federal Reserve in the Constitution? I can't find it. Where is the Federal Reserve's power to supersede the 14th Amendment? I can't find that either. And most importantly, where does the Treasury Secretary get off in saying that it's not her job to fulfill her constitutional responsibilities? So take a moment and think about that. I'm happy to defer back to the other experts and we can get into some of the questions. But thank you very much for being here. Maybe we can hand it back over to Professor Judge. Do you have any initial questions you'd like to ask?
Oh, I was specifically told I wasn't allowed to moderate. I was told that I was not in that position. So here, let me actually like come in though. I'll come in. I'm the professor, so I always have the ability to ask questions even when I haven't been planning on it. Actually, let's see. Right.
The trick is to not let you know in advance, you know?
Shall I moderate? And I was told you shall not moderate. I'll come back up. Actually, where you ended, there are some other one of the things that's been exciting about the conversation around the coin, it has spurred other proposals for unusual bonds and other options, interesting questions over if we actually get to that point. What are the range of options that might exist? And one of the interesting ones for me is, do you want to create a solution that just does away with this foolishness that's part of it, some ways the $20 coin is trying to get at? Or do we want to kind of say, like, if you're going to engage in partisan politics, so are we. So let's get this administration to where they need to be. And like, if the Republicans want to make decisions that might not be optimal for that in the future, like let them make those decisions in a public and politically accountable way. Like, how do we start to think about that when we get to the point of like, do we want to go forward with the coin or do we want to go forward with one of the other alternatives that's now emerging?
Do you want to maybe respond?
Okay. Invoking the 14th Amendment is, I think, along with the $1 trillion coin, sort of the two best options at the last moment. And I think the politics of this confrontation sort of drive toward a cliffhanger in which a decision would be made at the very last minute. And the reason for that is that it looks increasingly likely that the Republicans in the House in particular are in a position where they're committed to a confrontation to the end. Now, you never know about this until you get to the end. And also, the White House has laid out that it's not willing to make compromises and make major cuts in Social Security, Medicare, and other programs that Republicans in the House are calling for. So, and we're unlikely to see a loosening of those positions because both sides believe they can win in that confrontation and not just prevail in their policy preferences, but politically. The Democrats on the one hand believe they can demonstrate once again what they think are the irresponsibility in governance of the Republican House in particular. I think Republicans on the other hand are who are driving this confrontation believe they are playing to the base and that they can benefit by playing to the base. So I think we need to understand that both sides are in a position where politically they do not want to, they believe they can gain from the confrontation right to the end, or they could lose politically by appearing to be the one that backs down in this game of chicken. So in that situation, you want to have some solutions in your back pocket. And I think when you look at the 14th Amendment and you look at $1 trillion coin, certainly the 14th Amendment, invoking the 14th Amendment is more decorous. I mean, it seems more dignified to rely upon the Constitution. And I think there are some real advantages to that. But I think in terms of the politics and the public relations, it has some significant downsides. One thing is you want to get this confrontation. Once you make a decision that you're going to invoke the 14th or mint the coin, you want to get this confrontation behind you as quickly as possible. It's going to create a firestorm. You want that firestorm to be over and out as quickly as possible. Invoking the 14th Amendment is likely to lead to, I think, a protracted series of court challenges that continue for months and feed this story over and over again. Certainly, minting the coin will create controversy, but it appears to me that the law is and precedent is so clear about the Secretary's discretion to mint the coin. And the fact that in principle, there is nothing new in the $1 trillion coin. There's a couple new zeros on it, but that's it. And in that circumstance, that I think a court challenge will be, and it's hard to predict how courts deal with issues today, but I think this is more of an open and shut case. And we'd be able to get the controversy behind us rapidly, and we could deal with the entire debt limit once and for all. Minting the coin will defang the debt limit. So with that, I'll stop at that point.
Yeah, I think there are 2 points. One is the political brinksmanship point that Director Diehl was just talking about, right? You have 2 sides who are blaming the other side for not coming to the table. But the thing about a game of chicken is that it requires 2 people to play. You're both going down a highway at 100 miles an hour going, can you believe that guy not getting off the road? That's crazy, while you're pressing the accelerator, right? And driving directly into that, right? The president and the White House have the opportunity to get off this road and to stop risking a car crash that hurts everybody right now. They had the opportunity 2 years ago. They had the opportunity in 2011. We are still here because it was better politics for them to do it this way. And I understand the need to win elections, but I also understand the need to have an informed electorate and to respect the Constitution. And that what we are seeing right now is an incredibly dangerous game of chicken, where the actual hostage in question is everybody else. The people who lose when the government shuts down, the people who lose when checks don't go out, are the people actually being treated as chips in this game of Russian roulette. And I think it's completely unacceptable that not only does the White House mislead the public while simultaneously denouncing the other side for fake news and for misleading the public, but also they're doing so in a way that isn't actually winning. We're still having this problem every year. We're back. It's getting worse. The enemy is getting smarter. It is evolving to become less reasonable every time. So what is the choices? The choices are to stop playing this game. Right? My father was a federal bureaucrat. He used to say, there's never time to do it right, but always time to do it again. Well, time is running out. The other part of this is about the gimmickiness of it all. And what we are hearing today is that people would be more interested in considering extreme gimmicks like issuing a bond that has almost no face value, but an extremely high interest rate, because the national debt only counts the face value. If that's not an accounting gimmick, I don't know what is. They're talking about things like they've been doing since the 1980s, moving money around the Social Security trust funds, things like that, stuff that the Government Accountability Office once upon a time said was so out there that it was illegal at the time, and they had to pass a law saying, these are the forms of accounting gimmicks you are allowed to do, rather than the ones that you aren't next time we get to this moment. So we are talking about accounting gimmicks all the way down. The question is it an accounting gimmick that empowers the public, or is it an accounting gimmick that empowers bankers who understand bond markets and nobody else? Is it an accounting gimmick that obscures the fact that there's a big infinity sign in the sky next to the public fisc? Or is it one that allows that to be something that we can teach to every person in the country, including the 5-year-olds learning social studies, who might have something to think about here when it comes to the separation of powers and, I don't know, the money in the economy? It's kind of important, right? Understanding how it works for an informed electorate, kind of important not to be misleading everybody. So the question of, is this political hardball? I think the answer is yes, it's better political hardball than they've been playing. And the answer is it a gimmick? The question, is it a gimmick? Yes, but it's a better gimmick than the ones we've been using. It creates a better class of informed electorate.
All right.
You raised 2 points. One is one of the common misconceptions and myths that has been spun, I think on purpose in many cases, sometimes from lack of understanding, is that by the debt limit as we run up against the debt limit, we're taking the credit card away from Congress. That metaphor does not work at all. The credit card the money has already been spent on the credit card. And the question with the debt limit is whether or not we're going to pay that off, or are we going to default on that credit amount at the risk of defaulting on our mortgage. That is the appropriate metaphor here. We're not taking anybody's credit card away. We've already spent the money. It's, resting in as a debit at MasterCard, and it's as if we're just refusing to pay it and suffering all the consequences from that. The other point I want to address is whether or not the $1 trillion coin raises the money supply. And I think it's important here to talk about the difference between how a $1 trillion coin would be treated and how a circulating quarter would be treated. They'd both be produced at the United States Mint and shipped to the Federal Reserve. They'd go into the vaults of the Federal Reserve. Then the quarter would go into circulation, increasing by an infinitesimal amount the money supply in the US economy. The $1 trillion coin never leaves the vault. It stays in the vault. But eventually, having outlived its useful purpose, which is getting the country past the debt ceiling, it would be returned to the United States Mint and melted down, the seigniorage taken back off the books. The exact same thing happens with the quarter. It circulates in the economy, maybe for 20 years. It's damaged, it's worn out. It's returned to the United States Mint after outliving its useful life and is melted down. So the big difference between the two is the $1 trillion coin never enters the economy.
Yeah, I think as Stephanie wrote a whole book on this, which you haven't read, you should, call The Deficit Myth. It's the spending that puts money into the economy. It's not the whatever accounting you do within the government. And whether you quote unquote print coins or print paper or quote unquote print treasury debt, you can call treasury debt green money versus red money. When you're an investor, you're holding treasury debt as money. We don't worry about running a deficit in those situations. We deal with it, as Joe said, in the budget process. And I'm very glad to hear that Director Diehl actually lives in the Pacific Northwest with all of us. So my joke now is, if Director Diehl minted $1 trillion coin in the woods up here and it never got spent, would anybody notice? The answer is, of course not, right? It's only when it actually enters circulation that matters. So the other part of this is, Professor Judge asked, is there something to be afraid of here? I was a musician. I was a classical musician. I played French horn and cello. The composer John Cage used to say, people always ask me if I'm afraid of new ideas. It's the old ideas I'm afraid of, right? What we are having right now is decades of austerity, decades of government budget cuts, decades of unfunded obligations or things that should be being financed that are constantly on the chopping block. We had President Obama, after the largest economic crisis of our generation, asked when we were going to run out of money. And his answer to 60 Minutes, we're out of money now. It was not true then, and it's not true now, but that myth continues to hurt our democratic policymaking process. And lastly, to the point that it's already been spent, right? The idea that we would be taking the credit card away from Congress is exactly what the people who passed the 14th Amendment were trying to prevent. Because if you can take away the credit card for the thing that you don't like, white supremacists can take away the credit card for funding the Civil War. We do not get to second guess congressional decisions that have already been made. That is the recipe for constitutional collapse and a dangerous precedent more broadly. So if you don't like the spending that exists, if you don't like the way our government is going, vote, change the laws, put forth a bill that you can be politically accountable for. And the point I want to make about that is there is a reason that the Republican Party, and particularly the Freedom Caucus, is getting more and more aggressive with this, is because they know they do not have a majority of the popular will behind them. They will never get these kinds of spending cuts passed. They will never get the gutting of funding to LGBTQ education programs or anything else passed at the majority level. So the only way that they can push their agenda is through these kinds of counter-majoritarian jamming of existing legislation. We shouldn't allow it in the 1860s, and we shouldn't allow it today.